Det var jo de årene da en hadde nok så sterke indre brytninger. Indre brytninger.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for joining me here and for listening to me in what for most of you will not be your mother tongue. It's a great pleasure to be here with you in this beautiful space, and you should of course be very pleased, as am I anyway, that you have a prime minister who comes early in the morning to listen to discussions of philosophy. That's not something every country can boast of. So I will be here for the next 40 minutes or so trying to make what is essentially a philosophical argument about what freedom is and how freedom works and how freedom should inform politics. And I'm going to begin this lecture with some anecdotes from the war in Ukraine, because it's very often the more extreme situations which reveal to us what is in fact common sense. I have this idea that our everyday life often isn't the correct source of common sense, that everyday life fills us with mystifications and disinformation and conformity, and sometimes we need the extreme situations to see what in fact should be common sense. But before I talk about Ukraine, I need to share with you one thought that I always have as a historian when I come to Scandinavia. I'm a historian of Eastern Europe, and lately I've been a historian above all of Kiev. And every time I come to Oslo or to Stockholm, Copenhagen, I can't help but share the thought that there is a forgotten Scandinavian history. My references to your country are largely from sagas in which the heroes are in places in this funny land called Garda or Rus. And so many of the stories that inform Norwegians' sense of themselves, so many of the stories that were written down by Snorri in Iceland, those are in fact stories that cycled through Byzantium and through Kiev and then made their way all the way back to Iceland. The gods and goddesses of your myths were formed in many of their important respects. In fact, what made them interesting was their encounter with the Balts and the Finns and the Slavs and the Turkic peoples in Eastern Europe. And so you'll forgive me, but when I look at Oslo or Reykjavik, or when I look at Stockholm, I see it through the eyes of this larger Scandinavia, which once existed. And it's an accident of various things, among them the Cold War, I think, that Scandinavians don't see Rus or Kiev as part of one larger history. And I just want to encourage you to do so, because certainly Ukrainian history only makes sense when Scandinavia is included, but it also works the other way around. I think you'll find that your early history, at least, makes much more sense if you think of places like Holmgard and Kiev and so on, which were essential to your history as well as to theirs. So let me begin with a few anecdotes which will help us understand what I mean by freedom. The last time I visited Ukraine, I visited Kharkiv, which, as you will know, is in the extreme northeast of the country. It's within artillery range. Missiles take about 30 seconds to reach there from the Russian border. And Kharkiv, as you'll remember also in the beginning of the war, was a major target of the Russian invasion. The Russian army actually got into Kharkiv city and was driven out. And this reminded me, when I was in Kharkiv, of a very important concept that the Ukrainians have, which helps us to think about what freedom actually is. So the Ukrainians, like all of us, they sometimes speak of a liberation when they talk about returning a town to their own control. But they have another word which English doesn't have, and that word is deoccupation, deokupacja. Misto deokupowane, the town has been deoccupied. And in that distinction between deoccupied and liberated, in the space between deoccupied and liberated, one can begin to feel the difference between a negative and a positive concept of freedom. Of course, it is very important to remove the repression. If the Russians are driven out of a city, the torture chambers stop functioning, civilians are no longer executed. In that sense, people have been freed. The negative has been removed. The evil has been removed. But the city is not really liberated until the rubble has been cleared, the buses can run again, the trains can run again. The Ukrainians have a fascination with the trains and freedom, which I think actually makes a lot of sense. When people can begin to return to their lives, then there's been liberation. And so this is the essential distinction that one needs to make when one talks about freedom. Freedom must involve the removal of evil sometimes, but the reason why we care about the removal of evil is that we care about the good in people. It's only because of the people that we care about the forms of oppression. This point was brought home to me again and again over these last 3 years as I visited different parts of Ukraine that had been deoccupied. In a little village called Yahidne, which I believe the Prime Minister visited at around the same time that I did, the entire population of the town was held underground in the basement of the school for over a month. And during that time, several people were murdered by the Russian occupiers, and several others died because they were aged or sick and they were denied medical care. And in that basement of that school, there's a list on each side of the door frame of the people who were murdered and of the people who died. When the Russians were driven out of Yahidne, of course, people could come out of that basement. But were they free at that point? When I left Yahidne, the person who gave me the key to the school so I could visit the basement asked for help in building a playground. And that's the essential point right there. That school, which has been physically damaged, but which is also now a site of trauma for the entire village, there was a playground in front of that school. But they need a playground, they need a new place where the kids can play. And in the middle of a war where so much evil is taking place, where there's so much suffering and killing, you would think, well, why are people thinking of a playground? And of course, the answer is freedom is positive. It's not just negative. Removing the great evil from their town only raises the question of where will we send the children to school? Where will the children play? Where will the children exercise? Freedom is positive. Another encounter in Ukraine which brought this home to me was in Kherson Oblast, in the extreme south, in a very small village called Posad Pokrovske, where I spoke to an older lady named Maria, who was a wonderful, generous host, who wanted me and my friends to see the inside of the corrugated metal shack in which she was living after her house had been completely destroyed. In Posad Pokrovske, every single house was destroyed. Literally every single house was destroyed, and most of the population was gone, and several people had been killed. But she was an older lady living by herself. And of course, she was very happy that the Russians were no longer there. But when I looked at her, she was in her mid-80s, and she was somewhat disabled, and she walked with a walker. And there was still rubble between where she lived and the road. Her village, we would say, has been liberated, perhaps. We would use the word. But she won't be free until she can walk to the bus stop. She won't be free until that rubble has been cleared. So it's these extreme examples, I think, that clarify the issue. In English, at least, when we speak about freedom, what we generally have in mind is this notion of negative freedom. And the fact that this is so makes the term freedom very limited. I think it makes it false, essentially, but it also makes it politically difficult for people who have different views besides let's make the government small. So the case that I'm trying to make this morning is that freedom, I'll try to make three cases, that freedom is the value of values, and that we can define what freedom in fact is, and that if we do so, it takes on a different political significance and a different political meaning, perhaps a broader one and a more useful one. So my case is that freedom is positive, and this works out in several ways. Let me begin briefly by mentioning the traditional discussion, because it will inevitably come up. I was a student of Isaiah Berlin in Oxford, and Isaiah Berlin is known for many things, as he should be, but one of the things he's known for is an essay in which he described two concepts of liberty, one of them negative and one of them positive. And his idea was that these are distinct traditions. It was pointed out to Sir Isaiah in the 1970s by Charles Taylor and by a number of other important thinkers that the distinction between negative freedom and positive freedom really doesn't make sense philosophically. And the reason for that is negative freedom only matters because of positive freedom. It only matters to take you out of a prison cell because you're you. The prison cell is not the central issue. The barrier isn't the real problem. The real issue is you. It's not the barbed wire that's the problem. It's that you're behind the barbed wire. And once we remove you from behind the barbed wire, the question is still open. How do you become free? What does freedom mean? What is your life going to mean? What are you going to do? And so the way that the argument for positive freedom works is that it has essentially three steps for me. So this is now my case about what freedom is and how freedom is the value of values. The first part is moral realism. So this would be, if you like, the most conservative part of the argument. There are good things in the world. Beauty is good. Punctuality is good. You don't get a lot of laughs for that in Barcelona. Or it's a different laughter. Or people come in later and someone tells them about the joke. Spontaneity is good. Mercy, grace, loyalty, honesty. That there really are good things in the world. So honesty isn't real the same way that the stage is real, but it is real. It's a real thing. The second part of the argument, it would be moral pluralism. So there are good things, but all of these good things are not elements of a single thing. The idea that all of the good things are elements of one thing is totalitarianism, and we can speak more about that later. My view, and this was also Isaiah Berlin's view, incidentally, is that there are many different good things. They are all, in fact, good, but they're in tension with one another. So I think we agreed punctuality was good. We might also agree that spontaneity is good. But if you're spontaneous, you're often not going to be punctual. Most people would agree that consistency is a good thing, but most people would also agree that mercy is a good thing. But to be merciful by definition is to be inconsistent. Mercy by definition is making an exception. It's good to be honest, and it's also good to be loyal. And if after the lecture you say, "Hey, Professor Snyder, you're looking great today," is that honesty? Is it loyalty? So there are many good things, and we go through life making judgments about them, and we create character within ourselves as a kind of internal record of all of the judgments that we've made. And this is the third part of the characterization of freedom as positive, philosophically, is that the arithmetic or the geometry of moral goods is different than the arithmetic or the geometry of objects. So one can say those chairs are of equal size, or one can say that this painting is bigger than that painting. But you can't say that loyalty and honesty are the same size. You can't say that one is bigger than the other. It's simply a matter of human judgment which one you're going to apply in a given situation. And you can be right in many kinds of ways, right? You can be right by being loyal sometimes and honest at other times. But you can also be right by a different combination. You can be the kind of person who is honest most of the time, right? And that can still be a very good thing. So there's an arithmetic to these things, which is different from the arithmetic of the everyday world. And this is very, very important for understanding what freedom is. Because on the negative freedom side, when people talk about freedom as just being about resisting barriers, they're usually treating us humans as objects like other objects. The barrier is in the way, and so we need to knock the barrier down so we can move freely. Freedom is just about moving according to physical laws. It's nothing very special. Whereas if you think about freedom positively, if you think about us as being beings who are special because we can combine these values, you realize that what we are is that we're unpredictable. We're different kinds of beings in the world. We're not just physical objects. Because the arithmetic or the geometry of ethics is different than the arithmetic or the geometry of objects, we are not only unpredictable, but we emanate unpredictability out into the world, or into the universe, if you like. As far as we know, we're the only creatures who can do this. So freedom is meant to be positive philosophically. It's also positive, if I can put it this way, corporeally. It's positive in the sense that it involves affirming that we are all in bodies, that we are all born, and that we all die. And I'm trying to avoid the part in the introduction where it was promised that this lecture was going to be very dark. This is not a dark lecture, but we are in fact all going to die. That combined with we were all born, and that we all live in time in much the same way. We live in space in much the same way. We can't see our bodies, but we're all inside our bodies. These things are very important. These basic elemental things are very important for thinking about freedom. When I think about Maria in Kherson Oblast and her inability to get to the road because she's disabled and because there's rubble, that has to do with her body, and it has to do with my empathetic understanding of the limits of her body, which are fundamentally similar to the limits of my own. This is very important because it helps us get beyond, again, a negative understanding of freedom. In the negative understanding of freedom, the person is very abstract. The person's body doesn't really come into it. You'll never hear libertarians talk about birth. And yet birth is rather an important thing. You'll never hear them talk about illness, right? But illness is a very important thing. So in the image of negative freedom, the assumption is that the body is fundamentally sound, there's nothing to worry about with the body. Or if we're going to historicize this a bit, when we speak about negative freedom, the body that we have in mind is usually a male body, middle-aged, prosperous, healthy, and somewhere in the background are the women and the slaves who have enabled that male body to be where it is. And somewhere in the background of that is the empire, which enables the control of the women and the slaves. And all of that is removed from the picture, and all we see is the healthy male 50-year-old body. So this is a problem with the tradition of negative freedom, is that it makes invisible all of the things which allowed for the generation of that healthy male body. That healthy male body is presented as an individual, Whereas in fact, behind that male body was all kinds of labor performed by all kinds of other people, usually in conditions of submission. And of course, if freedom is going to be for everyone, that can't be the kind of image of the body that we need. The image of the body that we need will have to start from the things that we all have in common, like that we're all born, and that we all need certain things as we grow up. The other way that freedom is positive in a corporeal sense has to do with knowledge. So again, let me start with the contrast with negative freedom. The people who are in favor of negative freedom talk a lot about rationality. This is a clue, by the way. As soon as someone tells you that you're rational, you should watch out, because that's generally the beginning of a scam. We're not rational in the sense that's meant. Or to put it a different way, insofar as we're rational, it's not because we're alone. We can only be rational with the help of other people. The image of negative freedom is that we are rational, self-contained individuals who know what our interests are, and therefore life is a big marketplace, and we consume the goods that are best for us. The problem with that, and I hope this will not be a revelation, like that we're all going to die was a revelation, but the problem with that is that we don't actually know ourselves very well. And the only way to know ourselves is to listen to other people. We all go through life with big bits of metaphysical spinach stuck between our teeth. And we only find out about that when other people will tell us, and they'll only tell us if they trust us and we trust them. This is a very essential point, which was made by the German Jewish philosopher Edith Stein in her doctoral dissertation about empathy. Empathy, we say empathy, and it sounds like being nice. And of course, empathy is a nice thing. But empathy is also a precondition for freedom. If I cannot empathize with you, if I cannot see you as a human fundamentally like myself, then I won't listen to you, I won't trust you. And if I can't listen to you and trust you, I will never know myself. And if I can't know myself, then I can't be free. So in that sense as well, in a corporeal sense as well as in a moral sense, freedom is positive. Which brings me to politics. So if freedom is not negative but positive in a moral sense and in a corporeal sense or a physical sense, then we can also begin to talk about how freedom would be positive politically, how freedom can define what the tasks of government should be. And here you'll see I'm trying to resolve an old argument, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world or the English-speaking world, about freedom in government, where on the one side, people who believe in negative freedom say government is a barrier, government is a problem, let's make it as small as possible. And on the other side, the people who oppose that generally don't talk about freedom at all. In my view, freedom is the thing that justifies government. Freedom and government are not in any kind of tension. On the contrary, the thing that justifies government is the fact that freedom is positive, and therefore the conditions for freedom can only be created collectively. So this is the kind of tension or irony inside freedom. If you believe, as I do, that freedom is the value of values, then you would like to imagine that we are all free individuals. But in order to create a situation in which we are all free individuals, we have to do collective, generational political work together. Let me try to make this case. The way I make the argument in the book is that I speak of 5 forms of freedom, and each form is meant to connect the philosophical argument that I've just summarized with the more practical work of politics. The first form of freedom is what I call sovereignty. And the idea of sovereignty it doesn't have to do with the state, it has to do with the person. It's what other philosophers would call agency. The idea of sovereignty is that if we're going to be free, then we have to have the conditions as very young people, as infants, as small children, that will allow us to develop the capacities to be free. If freedom involves seeing choices and making choices, those are things that we have to learn how to do. They don't actually come naturally. And so freedom then begins with action developed, directed at the very youngest people. And in Norway, these are things which I don't have to preach to you about, probably. Parental leave, childcare, vacations. All of these things, I believe, belong to freedom, because these things not only make the parents more free, but they create the conditions in which a child can become more free. And here I'm bringing in the science of childhood development, because we have a very good idea of what it takes now to help children develop capacities, and we know that the first 5 years are essential. So whereas a negative freedom argument begins with a kind of imaginary 50-year-old male in 1846 in Great Britain, I'm trying to begin with real children and infancy and childbirth. The second form of freedom in my argument is unpredictability. As I said before, I believe unpredictability is the heart of what makes us human and the heart of what makes us free. But again, we have to create certain conditions so that we can grow up to become unpredictable. Unpredictability is very important because when we are predictable, we are prepared to be ruled. If we are predictable, if other people can predict what we can do, then it is very easy to rule us. If we can be lied to, then we become part of someone else's story, and we don't know how that story ends, but they do. If we are predictable to other people, and they are unpredictable to us, then they rule us, as we can perhaps see in the example of the American political system, where all the unpredictability is concentrated at the very top at the moment, which is an unhealthy distribution. And so making us unpredictable also takes work. It involves, and it's the next stage also in life. If sovereignty has to do with the first 5 years, then unpredictability is perhaps the ages 5 to 15, where we have to be very careful about things like exposing children to social media, which are designed to make them predictable, and where we have to be very careful about trying to educate children in such a way that they're exposed to things that allow them to become unpredictable, like lots of other people, like books, and so on and so forth. The third part, or the third form of freedom, is mobility. And again, this is biographical. It's like, say, the ages 15 to 30 or so, where you grow up, you become educated, you rebel against the very values that allowed you to become who you are. And this is normal. It's an irony that's inside freedom. It takes values to create a free young person, and then when that free young person matures, they rebel against those values and they choose somewhat different values. The mobility is moral, but it's also physical. And so again, to create an individual, there has to be collective political work or generational political work. When a person turns 15 or 16 or 17 or 18 and leaves the house, they can't leave the house if there's no road. And they can't build the road. And again, this may seem like a very simple point, but for negative freedom, I think it's a devastating point. Because negative freedom assumes that freedom is just a matter of being against things. But you can't even be against things unless a lot of people help you to do so. If you want to leave home and there's no road or no bus or no train, you're not going to get very far. And if you want to have a different profession than your parents, and there aren't accessible public schools and accessible public universities, you're also not going to get very far. And things like roads or schools have to already be there when people grow up. No 18-year-old or no 20-year-old can wave a wand and say, I would like a road and I would like it to lead to a public university. Those things have to always be there. The next two forms of freedom are more general, and they look back on life. One of them is factuality. So again, I take the rather old-fashioned conservative view that some things are true and some things are not. And I also take the view that the things that are true take work to find out. So again, one of the ways negative freedom tends to work is the claim that whatever you think is fine And that moves very quickly into the idea that the truth or the facts are actually a barrier to your freedom. They're a barrier, like the government, like barbed wire, like a wall. And you need to liberate yourself from the science, from the facts, from the elites. You'll only be free when you know nothing. And when you know nothing, of course, you can be persuaded of anything. I think that because freedom is positive, we are stronger, we have greater integrity, we're more capable of resisting when we have access to the facts. And this, by the way, speaks to the essential tradition of freedom of speech. At the moment, and again, this is the way people on the negative freedom side argue it, at the moment, freedom of speech means you have $300 billion and you own a social platform and you're annoyed that you've only reached 270 million Americans when you wanted to reach 280 million. And therefore, your freedom of speech has been violated. And this is very upsetting. And let's go to the Supreme Court. Nah, it's not a parody. That's the way it is. That is how free speech is invoked. Who invokes free speech in the United States? People whose free speech is not threatened whatsoever, right? And that's how the Supreme Court also defines free speech. Free speech is a concern for the very wealthy. It's not a concern for others. Whereas the whole tradition of freedom of speech, as it goes back to Euripides, quite rightly is based on the notion that it is dangerous for the powerless to speak truth to the powerful. And because it's dangerous, you have to protect their bodies. That's what freedom of speech is all about. So freedom in this sense, in the sense of freedom of speech, is also positive. We can't just say freedom of speech is a matter of the government doing nothing. If we do that, the entire information domain will be wallpapered by oligarchs and their nonsense. Freedom of speech has to involve creating conditions where people who are less free, less powerful, less wealthy can speak the truth without fear. It's positive. And I would go a step further. It also involves creating conditions in which we all have something to say, in which we all know things, in which there's local journalism, and in which there's education. I think without that, the notion of freedom of speech makes no sense. So the final part, or the final form of freedom then, is solidarity. And I think I've probably already explained this pretty well. Freedom can't just be for me. If I say freedom is just for me, I won't be free, because I won't actually understand myself without you. Freedom can't just be for me, because the conditions that we need for freedom, I can't build myself. And of course, the oligarchical syndrome is to think I can create those conditions for myself or for my family, and that's okay. But we see that even in their cases, it turns out not to be true. Have you noticed that they seem unhappy? And that they seem full of grievance, and that they think they want to start again on another planet, or that this life is so unsatisfactory that they need to live forever so they can have other lives. That's not a sign of contentment, right? So no one can do it on their own. Even the people who have all the wealth, no one can do it on their own. No one can be free on their own, as a psychological, as a philosophical, and also as a political matter. So I've tried to make the case for positive freedom, and you'll have seen along the way that I've been making the case against negative freedom as a place to stop. So of course we need to be freed from oppression sometimes, but that's only the first step. If we stop at negative freedom, we will not be free. If we stop at negative freedom, and this is the fundamental problem, we never have to define who we are and what we care about. If the problem in freedom is just the barrier, then I never have to ask who I am. I can just say the barrier is bad. I never have to take responsibility for what's good. And if the problem is just the barrier and that becomes my mental habit, it's very easy to shift from the barrier is the government to the barrier is other people who I don't like, to the barrier are the facts, which I find uncomfortable. And when I'm against the other people and I'm against the facts, then I'm a fascist. And so here you see how just at a simple logical level, the extreme libertarian position of negative freedom in fact leads to fascism. And you might have noticed that that is a thing which is happening in real life all around us. It happens psychologically, and of course it also happens politically. If you take a negative freedom point of view and you use that as a way to make the government small and dysfunctional, then you remove the collective ability to create the conditions for freedom. You generate a population which is in fact more anxious, more fearful, and less free. And in that way, once again, you're driving politics in the direction of the extreme right. And then I'm just going to mention this one more time, or make this clear. There's an Orwellian aspect to all of this in the use of language. The word free, in my view, can only apply to people. We are the only creatures we know of. Okay, I will concede in advance the octopuses, and maybe the aliens. But we are in general, with those possible exceptions, the only creatures who can be free in this way. An algorithm can't be free in this way. An AI can't be free in this way. We are the only creatures we know of who care about the good and have different ideas of the good and can make the universe unpredictable. That's us. That's us. And we are creatures that are born and die and live in certain kinds of corporeal constraints. Again, unlike the machines. It's just us who have this capacity to be free. And so it's not just dark and dangerous, it's also wrong when we let the word freedom slip into the digital world, and when our discussions of free speech become about algorithms rather than about children. And it's also very dark and dangerous when we let the word free slip away from us onto the institutions that we create. For example, the free market. There is no such thing as a free market, of course. The very idea of property rights is what the libertarians would call a government intervention. There is no such thing as a free market. A market only exists because of rules. And once you know that, it's just a debate about what those rules should be. But it's not that logical contradiction isn't the depths of the problem. The depths of the problem is this. When you take the word free away from people and put it in front of an institution, what you were saying is the people owe a duty to the institution. So as soon as I say free market, what I'm really saying is you have a duty not to intervene in the market. And suddenly the market is the subject and you are the object. That's the magic of words. And so the word free has to be kept with people, and this is part of positive freedom. So if this argument is right, and I hope it is, this way of talking about freedom resolves certain conundrums in politics. It resolves the apparent contradiction between freedom and government. The point of government is to create the conditions in which people can be free. And that justifies, by the way, many things that in Norway, which is a very country with lots of freedom, congratulations. But it justifies for the time being, it justifies lots of things that you justify in other ways in terms of solidarity or justice or national unity. And those are all good things. But I actually think the basic fundamental justification for the welfare state is freedom. That the welfare state creates the conditions in which people can then be free. I think that is actually its best justification. Another apparent conundrum which is resolved is the tension between freedom and security. I don't believe there is a tension between freedom and security. Almost all of the time, if you're more secure, you're more free. And if you're more free, you're more secure. There are some exceptions, but in general, if you think of freedom positively, the two go together. And the tension between individual and society, I also now do not see as a problem. In order to create individuals, you have to have collective social work. And the justification for collective social work, in my view, is the freedom of the individual. And then finally, present and future. We seem to be stuck in our current politics in a sort of, the Germans always have words for everything, so you probably do too, like Zukunftslosigkeit or Alternativlosigkeit, like a sense that there is no future, a sense that there is no alternatives. And that is where negative freedom puts us. If freedom is just about battling against something, then you're constantly in this horizontal world. It's you against the enemy, that someone else has probably put in front of you. And so you're constantly in this struggle, and there's no future. But if freedom is about people becoming who they are, then it is inherently about the future, and it brings the future back into politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Snyder. Now we are looking forward to having a short debate, a panel debate. So here we have, I guess, pretty well known for the audience, our Prime Minister, Jonas Gahr Støre, Kristian Berg. Yeah, give him a round of applause. Cecilie Hellestveit from the Norwegian Academy of International Law. I didn't really mean to skip you, Kristian, but this is Kristian Berg Harpviken, who's the director of the Norwegian Nobel Institute now. Very fair to you. And Helge Jordheim, who is a historian, but also now director of the newly founded Center for Global Sustainability here at the University of Oslo. So welcome to you as well. Prime Minister, I know you've been a very ardent reader of Professor Snyder's work. I know you've given his book on tyranny. I don't know. Do you know how many copies you distributed during the?
Many.
Many. How come?
Well, I came about the book in a bookstore in 2018, and I found it very compelling because it really brought the link between these big issues related to freedom, to the political situation in individual countries and in the world at the end of last decade, and the link to the individual. What can I do? Which I think is the question many people ask when you see these big events, and they ask, this is just too much for me. But this idea of having 21 lessons from the 20th century to be applied in the 21st century is very practical. I like that, the way you talk, the way you defend your institutions, the way you have to reflect on this. And I think also the work that Professor Snyder has done on Ukraine as an individual approach on this very critical topic for all of us, but also then relating this to broader freedom issues that relate to us here and now. This is fundamental. And I was also very moved when I read in his book on freedom that visit to that school, because I met the same traumatized people standing on the outside. And I think the way you describe it, Professor, that, are they free? They stood there, deeply, deeply traumatized, and there was no more occupation, the birds, it was lovely in the middle of the woods. But coming from Norway, meeting this extraordinary trauma of people having gone through this for a month was just, it's still with me. I can feel the smell of that basement. Mm. So, for that reason, I think, and the lecture that we heard now, it makes sense of philosophy in the big term, but also gives us some very individual lessons that can make more sense of life and politics and daily orientations. I come back from visiting Auschwitz yesterday evening, in front of, that extraordinary historic drama. And I met with President Zelensky. He was there, and you can feel the nerve. So what can we do? We can do things as government, and we can also do things as individuals. That is the compelling point, I think.
Professor Snyder, when you meet politicians, do you discuss freedom a lot with them?
Yes, I mean that's an interesting question. First of all, I feel very fortunate that I do get to meet politicians. I respect. I think we often don't. Those of us who have less regulated lives don't necessarily appreciate how much incredible hard work it goes into being a politician, and how many meetings and how few breaks, and just how much physical labor is involved. And so if a politician has time to talk to me, I'm honored by that, whether it be in Norway or the US, and it does happen. And then I do talk to politicians about freedom, yes, and because the way I have into the life of politicians is some version of what the Prime Minister just described. It usually has to do with either on freedom or Ukraine, and what people ask me sometimes for political advice about America, and I try, but what I really have to offer, I think, is a kind of connection between everyday political life and what it might all be about, and I think that in a way is the trick, right? That on the one hand, the work of democratic politics is relentless. The meetings, the campaigning, it's relentless. And the people who do it, many of whom have become my friends, by the way, over the years, are people I respect a lot and see regularly. The people who do it are forced into this routine, and they know that they're doing it for a purpose. And if they have a moment to talk about what that purpose is, then I'm very glad to take part in that moment.
Cecilie, let's lift it up a bit. You're an expert on security, basically, security issues. You've been working on many things, but that's one of the things you're an expert on. We're in this phase, geopolitically, of turmoil. Things happening, things being said. Close allies, talking about grabbing huge pieces of continents from each other and so forth. How can we as Norway is a small country, but I'm also talking about, I guess in the West, how can we navigate security and freedom and in this day and age?
Now. First of all, let me extend my thanks to Professor Snyder for writing this book, because we have been reading your work on a description of our current world, Unroad, the Bloodlands, on tyranny, and for the Scandinavian, Norwegian audience, this is something that very often is a description of the world out there. Mm-hmm. Now, what we are now realizing is that this is also hitting us. It's affecting us in ways that we have not previously seen. So coming from those works, you ask, so what do we do now? And this is how I read your book. I read your book as an attempt to answer that question. What should we do about it? And I'm going to make two reflections. I come from a Scandinavian country. My background is in law and war, and I read your book in a very specific way, as a manifesto for agency, on the one hand, and also as a compass. Because when it comes to the rules-based order, which is something that is very important for a small country like Norway, now things are moving. Now, it is not necessarily the entire construction that is changing, but the content of the rules is changing. And you are very specific in the way that you describe the law. The law is not necessarily an instrument for freedom. It can absolutely be an instrument for unfreedom as well. So when it comes to these bigger issues of the rules-based order, this is also where things are changing. We live in a world where the instruments of law, human rights law is basically the epitome of negative freedom. You say the state can be a threat, therefore you have treaties saying that the state is not allowed to interfere with human beings in this way. Now, in 1999 in Norway, we had this commission, this governmental commission on freedom of speech. And the result, the conclusion of the wise persons on this committee was that the state cannot interfere. So we introduced even a new rule in our constitution prohibiting the state from censorship before the utterance of speech. Now there was a new commission in 2022, and the conclusion of this commission was the exact opposite. We need regulation to protect freedom of speech. And that has changed. The perspective has changed because the world is different. The problem, of course, is what kind of regulation? Because if you start to regulate by the state, then you threaten a different part of freedom. So I think in Norway, we, as you also kindly reminded us, Scandinavia is bigger than the Nordic countries is bigger than we often think. But in this respect, I think that our societies, to some extent, embody some of the positive freedoms. But these are under threat. So how can we use this manifesto to try to find new solutions? And I'm going to say one more thing.
Or maybe you can, but I would like him to reply to the first thing you said first. She's from the same city as me, so I know how she works.
Oh, that's
it's the second largest city. We're famous for talking a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a discovery about Scandinavia. Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind remarks and for the friendly interpretation of the book. The point that human rights law is negative freedom is, I think, a kind of telling self-criticism in a way, because insofar as we think of human rights just as what government can't do, if we did fall into that habit, we would then be forgetting why it is that governments can't do these things, which is about the people. And much of my thinking in this book comes from people who were, in fact, generative of the idea of human rights in the 1970s and 1980s. But the way they thought about freedom was positive. It had to do with human eccentricity and unpredictability and precisely the things that make us special. And then on the question of freedom of speech, it's very interesting what you say. In the United States, of course, we have an even deeper problem of thinking of freedom of speech as negative. It really only comes to the Supreme Court. It's defined by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has a very self-conscious libertarian doctrine about it. But the cases that reach the Supreme Court generally involve people who are already very wealthy and privileged. And that leads us to these absurd findings, like, for example, the main violation of freedom of speech is that a wealthy person can't give as much money to a politician as he wants to. And that then becomes, that's where the freedom of speech debate goes. And so, as I said in the lecture, we have to talk about freedom of speech as the tradition of the powerless individual needing protection. And we have to start thinking about freedom of speech with children. So what are the conditions we create so that children can grow up as free speakers? And that helps us think our way into the social media platforms, because they have ways of formatting us that make us less free.
You met the 4-month-old baby called Nils here. We'll make sure to tell him, actually, on later. Cecilie, and then for your second.
Just a short follow-up on that, because our focus is increasingly on the speech instead of the speaker, on the research instead of the researcher, on the religion instead of the believer. And I read your manifesto, as I now call it, as a call to reorient the focus. And I think that is very appropriate, particularly when it comes to one of the elements of how you define freedom. The most important one for Scandinavia, I believe, and the most difficult one, which is unpredictability. This is the unpredictable dimension that you bring in, because this is why we fear the world today, because it is so unpredictable. But this is something that we have to embrace, because we live in a world where the biggest danger is that tech is trying to mind our minds. They are now getting control over the controller. And the problem is, how do we deal with unpredictability? Because the machines, they have the solution for this in generative AI and so forth. So the unpredictability is really a core of Professor Snyder's definition of freedom that really hits to the Scandinavian people, I think.
Would you like to give a short reply to that? Yeah.
Just that there. So when I taught the book in prison, I taught the book in a U.S. maximum security prison, and one of the points that the guys there made, it was a male-only facility, one of the points the guys made was, we don't understand what you're talking about with this unpredictability. Unpredictability is a problem for us. Our whole childhood was unpredictable, and that's why we are where we are. And so then what I tried to explain to them is that if we can create more predictability in the world, like your school is going to be good, you're going to have a job prospect, then you can become a more unpredictable person. And so there's a way that the two things work together.
Kristian, you've been working on peace research for a long time of your career. Professor Snyder here, he talks about negative and positive freedom, and I know you think that it's also important to distinguish between negative and positive peace in a way. How come?
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Snyder, for a great and inspiring talk. I'm both a sociologist and a student of peace and conflict, and you speak both to the sociologist in your emphasis in your definition of freedom on relationships, institutions, and governance, as opposed to the absence of all of those. But you also speak to the peace researcher in me, because ever back since the conception of peace research in the 1950s, there's been this preoccupation with, or this sense that the absence of violence alone is not satisfactory. Henceforth, the conception of positive peace. And I think the debate about positive peace and the debate about positive freedom, your main concept, are very similar. And there are many in my discipline who have problematized the conception of positive peace by saying, well, if we make everything into a question of peace, analytically, we're not able to say what is connected to what. And if I want to challenge you a little bit, I would say that your choice of the overarching concept forms makes it unclear to me whether the 5 factors in your book are really causes of freedom, consequences of freedom, or types of freedom. And I think the examples you give and the way in which you discuss them points in a direction where they may be all of those things. Maybe that's not a big problem if you think about this as political theory. But if you think about in terms of analytical social science, where you want to operationalize and research those things empirically, it becomes more problematic. Jon Elster, the Norwegian political theorist, in 2010, when I was a newly minted director at my former workplace, the Peace Research Institute, gave the first PRIO annual peace address. And I can never forget his first words. The talk was on peace, truth, and justice. And Jon started his talk by saying, it ain't necessarily so that all good things go together. And that stuck with me. And you talked about Ukraine, and you're certainly somebody who knows Ukraine 100 times better than I do. But I come to believe, when I talk to Ukrainians about their resistance towards an imposed peace, towards what we could call a negative peace, it's not that they wouldn't value the cessation of violence. I think most people, if they believed that a deal here and now would end the violence, would in fact value that quite highly. I think their main worry is that a cessation of violence would just lay the ground bare for other types of repression. And you talked about those forms of repression. Misinformation campaigns, destabilization, the whole playbook is already well known to the Ukrainians. So again, it may not be primarily the fact that we either want freedom in full or nothing. I think it may be more that what they want to prevent is that a cessation of violence lays the ground bare for long-term instability and repression, just in different forms. And that brings me to my last point, and I may be inviting a much larger discussion here, and I hope we can pursue that in different fora, but that would be also on strategic terms. I think it's a question how your position, which I think is both sound, intelligent, and helpful, how it contributes to if you will, in the political situation we are now, a broader alliance of all those forces who actually see freedom as something we need to strive for. So in other words, is there a risk that by defining a position that goes against the grain, against the position of many of those who would say they hold freedom dearly, and I don't disagree with the point that freedom may be used in very different forms, but if you are aiming for a broader alliance of freedom seekers, how do we position your definition of freedom within that broader alliance? I don't think freedom precludes disagreement, but how do we build that community of different positions on freedom?
Okay, I'll take the questions in reverse order. This is going to seem very, very old-fashioned, but my main concern in writing the book about freedom was that I was trying actually to get the definition right. That's what I was trying to do. I wasn't starting with how can I define freedom to bring the most people in, and I think, though perhaps ironically, if you say something which is new and which is a bit counterintuitive and which forces people to think, you might incidentally be laying some of the groundwork for a broader agreement. Because if people talk about freedom in the wrong way and other people don't talk about it at all, that's no groundwork at all, right? But I think the way I'm talking about freedom does shake people up. I just talked to someone who I greatly respect, an economist who's been a conservative for most of his life, but is kind of tilting leftward now. And he said, I've believed in negative freedom my entire life, but you've actually persuaded me. And he meant like with reason, which is that's incredibly old-fashioned. But he meant like the arguments of the book had actually said, oh yes, negative freedom logically only makes sense if you... So I didn't write it to try to reach out to everybody, but I do believe that if you shake up the idea, you can say to social democrats, for example, building roads and schools is in fact about freedom, or health insurance is in fact about freedom, and they have something to think about then. And to conservatives, you can say, look, I understand your opposition to government repression. I share it. But the reason that I share it is because I want people to live fruitful lives, and there are other things involved in that. And so I think it might work that way, but I'm actually just trying to get it right, because I think getting it right has its own kind of integrity. And also it's a sort of challenge to try to get it right. And then on the second point with Ukraine, I mentioned some of the things that I've learned from Ukrainians, but there were a couple of other points about freedom that were very important, that were affirmed to me in the Ukrainian experiences I've had. One is the issue of character. So when I talked to President Zelensky about why he stayed, and this is back in 2022 now, when I talked to him about why he stayed...
You make a big point of that in your book, that he stayed.
Yeah.
Everybody thought he would leave, but he stayed.
This is if you can imagine yourselves back to January 2022 or February 2022, how many of you don't have to shake your heads or nod, but how many of you thought that the president of Ukraine would stay and that the Ukrainians would fight and that they would actually defeat the Russians in the beginning of the war? A few people thought that. I know that the American leadership didn't think that. So I asked him about it, and the answer that he gave was not, and this is very important, it was not, I am a lonely hero and a courageous man. He started talking about his parents and his upbringing, and he started talking about the kinds of moral choices he'd made earlier. And in a very modest way, he said, so I reached this point where there was nothing else I could do. And that, I think, is how freedom actually works, where, if you're in negative freedom, you think, well, freedom is about the barriers and I'm about my impulses. Whereas if you're in positive freedom, freedom is about becoming who you are and changing the world by way of your commitments. And then it sometimes happens that because of who you are, you can only do one thing. And I don't think without that metaphysical point about freedom, we can understand Ukrainian resistance right now. There is an element of it which is about we wouldn't be who we are if we gave up. If we gave up, it wouldn't just be giving up territory or even life. We would be giving up a way of thinking about life, and that is unbearable. And I think without that, you really can't understand why they resisted, or for that matter, why they've been so successful. And this bears on the other point, which here I'm agreeing with you, but I'm going to put it in different words. They when I talked to them about freedom, so I had hundreds of conversations with Ukrainians about freedom, and not just with the president. I use that because it's kind of, everyone knows who he is, but I talked to all kinds of people whose houses have been bombed out, and I asked them what they thought of freedom. And the funny thing is, they all had thoughts about it. But one of the consensus points was, it's about the future. So they would say things like, the Russians got in the way of the future. So what we wanted was to have like grandchildren and schools and like prosperity. We had a vision of the future, and they took that away, and we want to get back to that. And that's how they thought about freedom. And that's positive, actually, as I understand it, because they wouldn't stop at, and this is so interesting, I've never heard a Ukrainian say, we'll be free when we get the Russians out. It's always when the Russians are out, then we have something to return to.
Jonas?
Well, I follow that. That's my impression also, talking to Ukrainians and discovering, as you said rightly, that how much did we know about Ukraine deeply in 2022? How much more we now know. There's still a lot more to learn, but I think that sense of resistance. The interesting point here is what we now see in many European countries, that Ukraine is not only fighting for Ukraine. So what does that mean, really? It means something at the strategic level, militarily. We have to have defense that will deter Russia from, or any other state wanting to take territory, from thinking that idea. So that's one dimension of it. But the other one is more kind of, again, deep down, what it means to develop societies, to move forward, to have something to strive for. Which I think has been woken up by the way Ukrainians are framing this. Exactly in the same way, ending this conflict militarily is just one dimension to what it will mean to be European, but basically being part of the free world. And I think this is going to be an extremely important theme to continue to work on in the coming weeks. Because we are now at a stage in this conflict where these issues may be very much put on the agenda. If there is end of hostilities or something will come in between, what will it mean to preserve security for Ukraine? What is a security guarantee, and what is in it for us, and what is at stake for us?
What's your best hope for the next coming weeks and months?
Well, I think that fighting normally in these situations stop when there is not combined will on both sides to continue to fight, because it's not delivering on the needs. And at some stage that will arrive. The Americans will have to define a strategy. It's not going to move until the US has a strategy. I think we suffered in the end of the Biden administration that they didn't really have a strategy either, and now the new one has to have one. But then the critical issue, which will be to all of us, is what does a security guarantee mean? And what do we have to put into it to make it real?
Helge, you're a historian. You're also written on political freedom. Actually published on a publishing house called Respublika, the best publishing house in Norway, which is owned by Agenda, by the way. But as a historian, you worked on this issue. I mean, I would like to end this talk with talking about the current situation and what we should do. But just briefly, if you want to bring a historical perspective into it, we have a historian as our honored guest. What can we learn from history?
I think it was interesting to listen to the Prime Minister and Professor Snyder now at the end talking about politics as a question for the future. And of course it is about the present and the future, but it also turns out to be a lot about the past, as we've seen. History is used as ideology for legitimizing different kinds of futures, and some that we want to avoid. And I guess one of the most important things with Professor Snyder's work for me as a historian has been sort of how a historian can intervene and be someone who talks about politics and how we can learn from history, right? Because this is the big question that Professor Snyder's books raise. How can we learn from history? Obviously, in certain ways we can, but how? His books are like Holocaust as a warning, the 20 lessons. And of course, in one sense, it's obvious. If we can't learn from history, what can we learn from? On the other hand, it's kind of absurd because we also know that history doesn't repeat itself. So how can we think about learning from history? And I think for me, looking at this partly from academia, is the great value of bringing that question in, being a historian that, like historians of old in a certain way, could advise politicians, could advise rulers. There's a long history for that. And think about history as sort of a collection of experiences that we can learn from. The big question, of course, is how do we do that? How do we learn? I don't think the model that we saw in early modern periods that we can do we do like Caesar did or not? Do we avoid doing what Caesar did? But there are other models for learning from history that I think are very prevalent in your work. And I just would be interested in how you see your role as sort of historian advisor, as historian philosopher, as someone who sort of use the past to think systematically about the future.
Okay. Well, thank you. I don't think about myself that way. I think about myself as someone who gets invited to breakfast and then I have to answer questions. But
I had in for breakfast at 7:30 this morning.
But I appreciate the question. I have some, and I share with you the kind of general, the notion that history is underused, and then the question of how you use it. One thing I think historians can bring to discussions is a sense of what's not going to happen. So we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we can make guesses and be right, but I think historians have a pretty good sense of what's not going to happen. I think that is a solid contribution we can make. In terms of positive things, and let me try to phrase this in terms of freedom. The negative freedom way of looking at the world is definitely that the past doesn't matter, right? The past is, if anything, it's one more barrier. It's always to be left behind. Think of a Hollywood movie. It's always to be left behind. It doesn't matter. The future is everything. Everything is possible. But the thing is, everything isn't possible. I'm sorry, but it's not. Everything is not possible.
We're all going to die, and everything isn't possible.
You know, you're trying to make my talk negative. It's actually been generally positive, right? So the thing is that the view that everything is possible actually becomes the view that nothing is possible very quickly. If somebody tells you everything is possible, then you're going to try things that aren't possible, and you'll soon come to the conclusion that nothing is possible. And that is also the way that negative freedom or libertarianism quickly blends into a kind of nihilism or fascism, right? Like everything is possible. Oh, wait, nothing's possible. Therefore, I'm against everything and nothing's true. Whereas in fact, and here's my big historical argument, some things are possible. But what historians can do is give you a sense of what things are, because everything which is possible in the future has some connection to the past, right? There are these sort of lines of possibility that flow from the past through the present into the future. Everything that happens in the future will have been possible because of something in the past. If you cut yourself off from the past, if you unmoor yourself, then you're in this world of everything possible, oh, nothing possible. Whereas history says, okay, some things are possible, and here's how. We've seen them before, or we see that some preconditions are actually present already.
I just, shortly.
Well, I'll make this short, but since we are in Norway and in a political context, one takeaway for me, let me just share that to be very honest. I believe that my side of politics, which I define to be kind of center-left, social democratic, Nordic sense, we have a big task ahead of us of retaking liberty as a political notion. not accepting that it is being taken over by tech giants, that negative freedom which is defining it in that sense. You know, I have one memory. I was Minister of Health and I went to New York to meet with Mayor Bloomberg at the time, because he had free breakfast for all kids in New York. And I wanted to understand why. Especially because in the Norwegian political debate, I met my opponents on the right saying, you know, this is about freedom of choice. Parents should be able to decide if they give the kids food to go to school. And we had percentage of a number of kids who go to school hungry. And then they learn badly and they disturb the class and it's bad for everyone. So I asked, you know, this philanthropist, capitalist, Bloomberg, sitting there in the middle of his room. He had organized his mayor office like a trading room. Interesting. And I argued this, and he said, I mean, freedom of choice makes no sense if you don't have the ability to make that breakfast. And many kids in this city, they don't have a kitchen. They have a heater for their water so they can have some, pasta or something in the morning, which they normally don't have. So I want to create that level playing field, at least when they get that meal, then they can move on. That came from him. I mean, it would not be a social democratic instinct, but I really believe it's a big challenge. We have to retake it. For me, it is freedom, and these kind of positive freedoms is about the vision of politics. And I just appreciate that we have now an even huger job to do after last Monday.
I'll ask you all, you know, this is difficult, but just shortly, if we sort of agree that positive freedom is a good thing, we want to strive for it. What are your best advice to us all, you know, to reach more positive freedom? And I'll start with Helge, and I'll let everybody say something, and I'll end with Professor Snyder.
Well, I think positive freedom is about conditions for life, and conditions for life in living in a society can only be created together. So the key here was the solidarity argument, I think, that these conditions for living good lives are only possible if we get together and find ways of creating them in solidaric ways. So I think that will be the lesson for me.
Cecilia.
Now I want to repeat the words of Jake Sullivan, the outgoing advisor to the Biden president when he was leaving office, saying that the technological development over the next 4 or 5 years is no longer uncharted territory. It is an unexplored galaxy. And when we venture into that galaxy, we need a compass. And I do hope that we will all take the attempt by Professor Snyder to give us that compass and to bring that along, because we are headed for not uncharted waters, but a new galaxy.
Thank you. Kristian.
I think we need to take with us the emphasis on cooperation and the collective aspects, the institutional aspects of Professor Snyder's argument. I think that is really at the core, whether we are addressing challenges that has to do with technological developments, ideological political developments, or even the breakdown of global institutional arrangements. And all of those are challenges that are very present as we speak. And I think this is a big debate. We need to pull together, and we also need to celebrate the good initiatives that are pointing us in the right direction. And in many ways, this session here today has been that kind of a celebration. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Yes.
2 things. I'd like to bring it back to one of the sentences you used, Professor, which is that you can never be free alone. Mm-hmm. I think that is a key point. And that's why I like to bring it back to some of the messages on tyranny, which is, telling people there are things you can do. You can resist unfreedom by some of your gestures, some of your choices, some of the way you deal with daily institutions. I think that's one point. And the other one is, as we discussed earlier this morning, Professor, that we now focus a lot on the challenges and the negative threats, but there are also positive things. And to have that instinct to say that, let us salute and celebrate and enjoy the positive things. There are a lot of good deeds. People are doing good things. They have good intentions. So if we cannot be inspired by that, I think we will be weaker in resisting what is bad.
So I'll land on that as well, because the thing about negative freedom is that even when it succeeds, it doesn't seem to make people very happy. And from my own country, I'm looking at the prospect of these two men who have together risen to the heights of power, and in Trump's case, wealth by selling a meme coin. And they don't seem happy to me. And I'm not and I don't mean this ironically, I'm not really even sure how free they are. I feel like I know people with a lot less money and power who are living much more free lives than they are. And the thing about positive freedom is that it allows you to have a good time. It allows you to enjoy other people. It allows you to appreciate what's different about other people as you do things. And this is the point. Freedom is metaphysical in the sense that it's about goods, integrity, justice, grace, beauty. It's about things that we can't touch but that are real. But it's also about bringing those things to life, and you can only do that with other people who are a little bit naive and who believe in good things and are taking little risks by trying to bring those good things into the world. But when you do that, you feel a little bit more powerful and you feel a little bit more free, but you also just feel better in general. So I'm gonna land there, because this world of tech and this world of artificially produced mass alienation is not a free world, but it's also not a happy world. And it's, I think, in the process of doing things with other human beings and recognizing them that we become more free and become more ourselves. But I think we also feel better. And feeling better is also political. If we can sustain ourselves and not feel dismay and alienation, it's more likely that things will turn out better in the end.
You know, we have freedom, and we have...
So my secret ambition in coming here was to get a room full of Scandinavians to applaud happiness.
Thank you all.
Now my work is done.
Yeah, there's freedom and there's time. Our time is up, but we have the freedom to keep working for more freedom. Thank you, everybody.